There's a lot of people here today, and there's a lot of things to talk about. The theme for today's event is the Clinton Doctrine. Now, one of the big issues is there one? Should there be one? What will it be? We may learn some things tomorrow when Clinton speaks at the United Nations, but in the meantime, we're going to hear two of the leading critics and analysts working in the field of U.S. foreign policy and international affairs working in this country today, Dr. Noam Chomsky and Dr. Michio Kaku. I'm Phyllis Bennis, and the program this afternoon is brought to you jointly by Worldview and WBAI's Public Affairs Department. Popular institutions all in this era of the New World Order here in New York. The Clinton Doctrine, such as it is, or isn't, is about to come face to face with the long nemesis of U.S. doctrines of the Cold War era, a new crisis in Moscow. This time it's Moscow, the capital of Russia, not Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. But a crisis nonetheless. We have yet to hear exactly what the U.S. position is going to be beyond a sort of genuflection to Boris Yeltsin and his upholding of a market economy presidency and the diminution of the influence of those in Parliament. The Clinton administration talks about the question of reinventing government. That's, in my view, not such a bad idea, although what they envision as that reinvention probably is not exactly what we in this room might think were the appropriate solutions to governmental crisis. Nonetheless, we're beginning to get a few hints in recent speeches by Warren Christopher, by Madeleine Albright, and others of the Clinton administration foreign policy team, Anthony Lake, a number of others. One of the key questions that seems to be emerging is what follows containment as a key word, as a slogan for U.S. policy, now that the issue of containment of the socialist countries, containment of the Soviet Union, is no longer something that can justify interventionist politics around the world because the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc have collapsed. So the fig leaf doesn't quite stand anymore. And one of the new buzzwords that's beginning to be floated is the question, interestingly enough, expansion. Now, expansion of what, you might ask? Expansion of human rights, expansion of democracy? It's not quite that easy. What seems to be underway is expansion of a new concept, something called market democracies. Those are the good guys that we like, says Washington. Not the democracies that might elect people we don't like, but people who will be elected who think that the IMF and the World Bank and other international lending institutions have the right idea when they talk about structural adjustment, when they talk about programs that will impact the poor, that's okay. We're getting hints now that the Clinton Doctrine in questions of intervention are going to be based on a new series of rationales, a new series of ways in which U.S. intervention around the world will be justified. The new democracies are a possible target for intervention to help them in their quest to become market democracies. Those countries of the wannabe West, the former countries of the East that have decided to throw in their lot with the western part of Europe, the United States, and Japan, in an effort to distinguish themselves from the South, the third world, the developing countries, the countries that are not market democracies or market anything else as a result of years of colonial forces. So these are the areas where intervention may be possible. Intervention may also be justified, we are hearing in these hints of recent speeches, to stop the rogue states, the states that are out of control, states usually named as Iraq, Iran, North Korea. Once in a while Cuba is mentioned in the same breath, but that's a little harder to justify. So often it includes North Korea, Iraq, and Iran alone. Sometimes Syria, although these days Syria seems to be more on the administration's good guys list, so they're not so inclusive. What all of this means is that the Clinton Doctrine is faced with dealing with a new set of international realities, a new world order, if you will. George Bush was right. There is a new world order. There are changes in power relations. There are changes in international alliances. Friendships have been broken and remade in new ways among old enemies. Old friends are breaking apart. Long-standing enemies are becoming bosom buddies. But there doesn't seem to be any change in the fact that the countries of the South remain impoverished, remain unable to control their own destinies, free from the interference of the North. The North-South divide has survived this new world order. And what we may see in the Clinton Doctrine is a way in which those divisions will play out. In Somalia, we have seen the transformation of what was claimed to be a humanitarian effort into something that no longer can be disguised as anything other than naked force, with the U.S. riding roughshod on the United Nations and becoming a major player in an internal battle in Mogadishu. In Bosnia, we see a claimed concern for humanitarianism, replacing the possibility of military shifts, even allowing the Bosnian government to obtain weapons to defend themselves, and the U.S. standing back and saying, well, we couldn't get agreement with our European allies on this one, so we think we're going to stand back for a little while. And in the Middle East, with all of the excitement and all of the cheers and all of the jubilation that greeted the signing of the agreement between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Israeli government, we see a real framework that was determined by U.S. efforts that go back for many years in the region, despite the claims that this agreement was only possible because the two parties were able to meet alone, outside of the range of intervention by anybody else. And they met alone in Oslo, and magic of magics, they came up with a solution, and now we're going to have peace. Well, it may be that this agreement that was signed is going to be the first step towards something that will be called peace in the Middle East. But I think when we think about that, we have to keep in mind the definition that Martin Luther King gave us, that peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice. And when we evaluate the terms of this very uneven agreement that was signed in Washington with such fanfare, we have to acknowledge that this is not an agreement that can lead to justice. It may indeed lead to something that will be called someday an independent Palestinian state. That's not impossible. It's not likely, but it's not impossible. But I think that what we have to recognize is that such a state, if it were allowed to come into being in this new world order, because nothing happens outside of that context these days, that new state is going to be not really independent, strangled by a so-called confederation with the Jordanian monarchy, controlled economically and militarily by Israel, oriented towards U.S. and Western business interests, dominated by the IMF and the World Bank, and perhaps quite repressive at home. It is not necessarily going to be the kind of state that we all fought for. But it doesn't exist yet, and in my view it's far more likely that it will not come into being as a result of this very uneven and unequal imposed agreement, but that rather we are going to see a continuation of injustice in that very volatile region called the Middle East. Because the era of decolonization is largely over. And decolonization in the context of the New World Order is somewhat anachronistic. It's not something on the agenda of those who order this new world. So I think that we have to keep in mind this notion of the New World Order, that it is something new. It is a new set of international relations. It is a new set of power relations. And it is one in which strategy has been turned upside down and inside out and is still taking shape. And now to move to the main part of our program for some discussion on weapons development and militarism in this post-Cold War world. Dr. Michio Kaku is going to talk. Michio Kaku is a professor of theoretical physics at the City University of New York Graduate Center and author of To Win a Nuclear War and Beyond Einstein. Michio Kaku is also, of course, a popular commentator on WBAI here in New York. Michio Kaku.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. And in order to set the stage for Professor Chomsky's talk, I want to focus in on the future development of weapons of war in the New World Order. You know, some people say that the New World Order is like a return to the plantation, where the massa sits on the porch, sipping his lemonade with a whip to keep the darkies in their place. But what will be the whip of the 90s into the next century? What is the big stick now that the East-West conflict is over, and now the true dimensions of the North-South conflict, dating back 500 years, the true dimensions of the North-South conflict are now in place. What is going to be the big stick? Well, before I do that, let me first say that I would like to extend my congratulations to Nelson Mandela and the ANC at the United Nations. He has proclaimed, quote, "The countdown to democracy has begun," unquote, in his country. And that's why I say that the victory of the people of Azania is inevitable and irreversible. And I'd like to say that there's a real lesson in what is now evolving in Southern Africa. The racist regime in Southern Africa used the most advanced police methods. They use computer technology. They use the latest in crowd control. My God, they developed 7 atomic bombs to preserve their power. And now we see a nation in transition as the ANC begins to seize control of the levers of power if all goes well. And the lesson is that the will of the people is greater than the man's technology. The South African, the peoples of Southern Africa are building a just society. But what about our society? What about the end of the Cold War and the promised peace dividend? Remember that? The peace dividend? No one talks about the peace dividend anymore. And yet military bases are being closed in the United States. But what happened to the peace dividend? Well, it's now a cruel joke. If you take a look at the Clinton military budget, it's almost a clone of the Bush budget. Military bases in the United States, some of them are being closed, but they're being streamlined to become leaner but meaner. Yet not one foreign military base of major note has been closed. In fact, in the last 2 years, the only military bases that have been closed are not by Clinton, but by Mount Pinatubo, which wiped out Clark Air Force Base and Subic Bay Naval Station. You know, in the next election, I'm tempted to write in. The only force which has actually closed a U.S. foreign major military base, Mount Pinatubo, rather than a Democrat or a Republican. Let's look at the numbers. Almost 400 military bases around the world, large and small, 395 to be exact, according to the Center for Defense Information, based in 35 countries around the world to maintain a globe-spanning empire. $270 billion in the current Pentagon budget, $200 billion for overseas military intervention. Now let's bring it home. This means that for every soldier fielded overseas, the taxpayer spends $100,000 to feed, maintain, and arm every soldier overseas. $100,000, and we have 500,000 of them overseas. And yet the right wing complains when only a few $100s is spent feeding and clothing a starving, sick child in the ghetto. I say that's obscene. But why isn't it ever posed this way in the media? Because the media, of course, is this tremendous debate in the media between spokesmen of the right wing and the far right wing. And that's why you're not going to see it posed that way. 3% of our budget goes to welfare. 3%. And yet 50% goes to the Pentagon, servicing the national debt, servicing the Department of Energy's nuclear forces, and yet another 20-30% goes to middle-class entitlements. And they complain about 3% that goes to aid to children, families with dependent children. You know, Washington is so corrupt that it's sometimes said that, well, they ask the question, what do you call the only honest, decent person in Washington, D.C.? And the answer is a tourist. But in all fairness, people say, well, it's a dangerous world out there. There are terrorists out there. It's a dangerous world, and we got to be armed to the teeth. Let me tell you, the only terrorists I know are sitting in the CIA. And that's why I say the time has come to abolish the CIA. The CIA has outlived its usefulness, whatever usefulness it ever had. It's a dangerous world out there, they say. That's like a ferocious saber-toothed tiger with blood dripping out of its mouth, saying that it's a dangerous world out there. Look at all these killer rabbits. It's a dangerous world out there. That's why we ferocious saber-toothed tigers must maintain the New World Order. Well, let's now zero in on the stick, the big stick, the whip. 2 weeks ago, I was speaking at Oxford University. I was speaking at a conference on mathematical physics at Oxford. And I went to London. I visited my favorite place in London. Maybe it's your favorite place as well. The British Museum. A treasure trove of booty. A treasure trove of loot from 300 years of the empire. Priceless booty ripped off from the peoples of the world. Priceless mummies stolen from Egypt. Priceless religious artifacts stolen from the Middle East. The Acropolis in Athens, Greece. Parts of the Parthenon are in the British Museum, stolen, of course, by the British. In fact, the guide there was telling me that at night, sometimes Middle Eastern religious people come to these religious statues and kiss these statues. These statues are their religious heritage, now based in the British Museum, and they come here late at night to kiss them. Well, let me say one thing. What happened to the empire? The British Museum is all that's left of Rule Britannia. Britannia rules the wave. One reason for that is that they put all their eggs in British gunboat diplomacy. Their economy was rotting apart. They were being challenged by the rising German Empire. But they put all their eggs in British gunboat diplomacy. And now Clinton is making the same mistake, putting his faith in the big stick. So now let's talk about the big stick. In 1988, a document came out, a very important document, came out laying out the next decade of warfare called Discriminate Deterrence. A year later, another document, Conventional Combat Priorities, came out. These two documents were written by a rich man's club, loosely affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations, the premier think tank for the ruling elites in this country. And it's sometimes said that in America, there's only one class that really is aware of itself as a class. There's only one class in this country that understands its role in history, its role to preserve its influence, and that's the ruling class. Well, Discriminate Deterrence, Conventional Combat Priorities lays it out. There are two trends in the world, they say. First, the atomic bomb doesn't strike fear and terror in the hearts of our enemies like it used to. With the rise of the Soviet Union, no one believed in the big stick anymore. No one begins to believe that we'll use nuclear weapons if the Soviets will clobber us, if we were to use nuclear weapons. And therefore, one of the goals is to make nuclear weapons usable once again. The second trend, a multipolar world, meaning a much more complicated world as Europe, Germany, Japan, even China, at some extent, begins to make the world much more complicated, and the United States has to rely on its big stick, high technology. High technology in all its forms. Now, let me say one thing. Violence is the last resort of the elite. The elite would much prefer economic strangulation, as it's doing to Cuba, playing a cat and mouse game with Castro. It much prefers that. However, violence is the last resort. And let me lay out now 4 high-tech systems now being studied very intensely by the Pentagon. The first, a new generation of weapons to make nuclear weapons usable once again. First, of course, was Star Wars. Star Wars came up with a very big hindrance, and that is the laws of physics. So for the moment, the ruling elite places its emphasis on 4 kinds of technologies, among them third-generation hydrogen bombs, small hydrogen bombs that make nuclear weapons usable once again, that will strike fear and terror simply because they're so small they could be used for the first time in warfare. The first is the micronuke, a 10-ton weapon to be used against underground bunker positions, like in the Gulf War. The mini-nuke, a 100-ton nuclear weapons specifically designed to be used in the atmosphere. And of course, you saw the Patriot missile missing many times, and the Scud, of course, disintegrated in its trajectory, landed all over the place, creating more damage. The new mini-nuke is going to explode a hydrogen warhead in the path of a Scud missile. Nothing will withstand the force of a hydrogen warhead, and that's the mini-nuke. Then we have the tiny nuke, 1,000-ton nuclear weapons specifically designed against large troop concentrations that are dug in underground installation, hardened bunker positions. Now let me ask yourself a simple question. Who's going to be on the other end of the micro-nuke? The mini-nuke, the tiny nuke. Who's going to be in those underground bunker positions? Who's going to be firing Scuds? Who's going to be having large troop concentrations? Think about that. At the Gulf War, in the January issue of Newsweek magazine, laid out the use of nuclear weapons against Saddam Hussein as a last resort. The second is actually more insidious. The second weapon they're thinking about is designer germ warfare. You know, disease has always been a weapon of war. You know, the United States government committed unspeakable genocide against the Native American peoples, giving them blankets infected with the smallpox virus, knowing that it would wipe out millions of Native Americans. Now we have designer germs specifically tailored for certain kinds of warfare. The United States government spends $4.2 million funding the Naval Biosciences Laboratory. Now, what does it study? Does a Naval Biosciences Laboratory study poverty, the diseases of the ghetto, malnutrition, the diseases that infect the tropical areas of the earth? No. $4.2 million are spent studying the bubonic plague, San Joaquin Valley fever, Lassa fever, Rift Valley fever, and other diseases of mass destruction. At the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases in Fort Detrick, right outside Washington, D.C., accidents have actually happened when people have spilled test tubes containing designer-modified, lethal, incurable diseases that historians thought we once put the lid on. Cuba, in 1981, even accused the U.S. of releasing dengue fever. 300,000 Cuban cases were reported, and it was no accident, they say, that 3 areas were hit simultaneously in Cuba. And then the ace in the hole, ethnic germ weapons. Think about that for a moment. 25 years ago, I was at a demonstration at the Presidio in San Francisco. We were protesting ethnic weapons, weapons specifically designed to be used against ethnic people. For example, Afro-Americans are more likely to be infected by sickle cell anemia problems, Tay-Sachs for Jews, for Asians, lactose deficiency. We protested at the Presidio, and after that they put a lid on all information coming out about ethnic weapons. Think about that. Think about the blankets given to Native Americans. Think about ethnic cleansing, complements of the biotech revolution. Think about that. The third, non-lethal weapons. The Wall Street Journal calls them nice weapons. You've heard about smart weapons. Now, the people who brought you smart weapons now bring you nice weapons. These are weapons specifically designed to immobilize the enemy. For example, you have enemy troops. You hit them with infrasound sound so low that they begin to vomit. You hit them with chemicals which will eat rubber tires, turn gasoline to jelly. You have oils which will slick airfields, make it impossible to release jets. You're talking about spreading computer viruses into computers. And in the Gulf War, the first nice weapon was actually used. It was released about a month ago by the New York Times. The first nice weapon was used, cruise missiles that launched webbing, steel webbing against power plants, short-circuiting massive power plants. Now, these nice weapons are not humane because they keep people alive. After all, these laser weapons are designed to fry the eyeballs of people inside tanks. These microwave weapons to cut enemy communications will fry humans like chickens inside their tanks. These are not humane. They mean that it minimizes damage to the enemy power plants so you can take over the enemy power plants after the war is over. Think about that. Nice weapons. The fourth, you've probably heard about the global satellite system that we're now launching. Detroit says that in the future, if you get lost on your way to grandma's house, you'll have a computer which tells you where you are within 20 feet, anywhere in the United States. Now, ask yourself a question for a moment. The Pentagon is spending $10 billion launching 24 globe-spanning satellites just so you're not going to get lost on the way to grandma's house. Now, does that feel kind of funny? Is something wrong with that? The real purpose of NAVSTAR, the Global Positioning System, was to launch a first strike on the Soviet Union. If you have two gunslingers, with one gunslinger with the ability to shoot the gun out of the enemy's holster with razor-sharp accuracy in a first strike, you win a nuclear war. That's the real purpose of NAVSTAR. Not so you can go to grandma's house, but so that the Trident will land right on top of a Soviet missile silo. Okay? Now, however, the Wall Street Journal last month said that there's a fundamental weakness with regards to the NAVSTAR system. You see, it turns out that the North Koreans, the Iraqis, and the Iranians, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Indonesians, Egyptians, Israelis, and the Taiwanese can also tap into this global positioning system and guide their cruise missiles with the same system. And who's most vulnerable? Think about it. Who's most vulnerable to having a gigantic web hit our power plants? Who's most vulnerable to computer viruses? And the greatest of all nice weapons is, in a war, they will shoot a hologram on the clouds. A hologram three-dimensional image of a Muslim martyr telling the Muslim fundamentalist warriors, go back to Tehran. A huge martyr in the sky. Seriously, this is what the Wall Street Journal laid out. You can imagine that. It's one of the Muslim martyrs in the sky saying, Bill Clinton is your friend. This is what they have, okay? Now, I'm running out of time, so let me now close on the following note. There are two trends laid out in discriminate deterrence, two trends. The first trend is the rise of the United States, the rise of the unipolar world, and let me make no doubt about it, it is the rise of a unipolar world. But there's a second trend identified by these documents, a second trend. And the second trend is economic constraints on the West. Popular constraints on the West. You see, the United States is falling as a global power in terms relative to the rest of the world. Of course, Europe is also rising at the same time. But in 1945, the United States controlled 50% of the world's wealth. Half the world's wealth after World War II. Now it's less than 25%. And there's something they fear, and that is, with increased democracy, constraints on their use of power. Let me end now on one story. In my book, To Win a Nuclear War, I came out with the fact that in 1969, President Nixon had a plan to end the Vietnam War. He got elected on that plan. We now know what the plan was. The plan was called Operation Duck Hook. It was the plan to drop 2 atomic bombs on North Korea after November 1st, 1969. Duck Hook was in 2 volumes with a blue cover. On the cover was a jet taking off from an aircraft carrier armed with tactical nuclear weapons to be dropped on North Vietnam. In the appendix of Volume 2 were the targets, specification of the targets to be hit after November 1st, 1969. Nixon could have done it. He had all the cards. He said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. And the question is, why didn't President Nixon launch Operation Duck Hook? Why didn't he unleash the full fury of American nuclear might after November 1st, 1969? Well, to find out, buy a copy of my book. It's probably back there someplace. Now, let me tell you the real reason. Nixon himself stated it. In October, there was a tremendous demonstration. 250,000 people marched in the streets of Washington, D.C. After November 1st, a second demonstration, another 250,000 people marching in the streets of Washington, D.C. So let me tell you right now, there's one force more powerful than a hydrogen bomb. There's one force more powerful than the stick, and that is a people united can never be defeated. A people united can never be defeated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michio. It's important in these days of the New World Order, when things do at times appear glum and settled, to realize that there are factors that Washington may not have fully taken into account that can be looked to for the future. As we move on with our discussion of the Clinton Doctrine and how it may emerge in Russia, the Middle East, Somalia, Bosnia, China, other hotspots of the world, in NAFTA, in the reinvention of government to the degree that that takes shape. Our next speaker is Dr. Noam Chomsky, who is a professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and one of the leading critics working in the United States on issues of U.S. policy, both foreign and domestic, author of a number of books, including Deterring Democracy, Year 501, Rethinking Camelot, and currently at work on a new book called World Orders, Old and New, the same name as the introduction to the book Altered States. And I think this question of world orders that are new and that are the reflection of what is left over from the old is very much the context in which our new Clinton doctrine may be emerging. Noam Chomsky.
I forgot to ask Phyllis for permission to steal that title from the introduction. I hope that's okay. Yeah, if not, I can still arrange a change. Titles are hard to think of, though, I must say. That's the hardest part of writing a book. Talking about the Clinton doctrine, or new Clinton doctrine, there's several ways to approach it. It's possible to give an extremely short talk on this topic. Namely, just to say, well, there isn't any. There are just old principles which are being adapted to new contingencies, and that ends the story. There's no new Clinton doctrine, and that's more or less accurate. It would also be possible to give a very long talk in which, because there's a lot to discuss under this rubric of there not being any new Clinton doctrine. One has to do with the principles that are very old and very stable, and they're important. Then there's this whole range of specific topics in domestic and international affairs, a number of which Phyllis and Michio have mentioned. And then there are very important developments in the international scene. One of them is, of course, the end of the Cold War. Another, which in my opinion is a lot more important, though, doesn't look so visible, are changes that have been going on in the international economy, in the international economic order, essentially in the past 20 years, dating from the Nixon administration from about 1970, which have enormous effects on everything that's going on. Now, I'll have to not give a short talk saying we're finished and not give a very long talk trying to really address these topics. I've got to do something in between, so what I'll do is pick a few of the topics and barely allude to the much broader developments that are conditioning them in the background, although that is where I think one has to turn to really understand in a serious way what's going on. Well, I mentioned three background things that one might want to talk about. One is the stability of principles over a very long period. Another, the two major developments in world order, in current world order that I mentioned. With regard to the stability of the principles, it's in my opinion, very important to bear in mind how little has changed. In fact, how little has changed for hundreds of years. So with regard to, Phyllis mentioned the emphasis, and in fact she's right, it's talked about all the time. Now we're interested in market democracies. Well, of course, we've always been opposed to functioning democracy. We, I mean people in power, have always been opposed to functioning democracy for perfectly obvious reasons, including the ones that Michio mentioned. If there's a functioning democracy, it's going to infringe on the prerogatives of power. There's been a big problem ever since the English Revolution in the 17th century, which is the first modern democratic revolution. The question always is, how do you keep the rabble under control? They're winning some rights. They're causing us problems. How do you keep them under control? That remains a problem. Sometimes you can do it just by violence. Sometimes you have to do it by other means. But that problem remains. As to market discipline, that again goes back very far. And it's extremely important to understand exactly how it's used. It's a kind of a two-edged sword. Market discipline is always considered as essentially being fetters for the weak, because it's well understood that anyone who observes market discipline will be destroyed. On the other hand, these fetters are to be cast off by the strong whenever they feel like it. And in fact, there isn't a single case on record of a developed, successful society from England starting in the 17th century through the United States and Europe and on to Japan and its, the new industrializing countries in its domain. Every single one of them achieved that success by radically violating the doctrines that we're trying to impose on the third world. I mean, that's one of the most clear and, unmistakable lessons of economic history. And the reason for that goes right to the present. In the last 10 years, for example, the rich countries, the OECD countries, 24 rich countries, became considerably more protectionist, with the United States, Reaganites, well in the lead, incidentally, in violating the principles of economic liberalism, while they were even more passionately outspoken about the need to impose these on the third world than they ever were in the past. Now, the same thing's going on in Eastern Europe, as that is returned to the third world where it came from. Just to give an indication of what these principles look like, in case anyone thinks they're new, we can look back to the obvious place. Right after World War II, when the U.S. had this position of unprecedented power that Michio mentioned, it, of course, wanted to design a new world order. In fact, that was talked about. The place where, there's no time to talk about the whole story, but the place where the U.S. could impose its principles most explicitly and without difficulty was, of course, Latin America. That was completely under U.S. control. One of the first moves of the United States in the New World Order of 1945 was to kick its rivals out of Latin America. Traditional rivals were France and Britain. They were now weak. We could finally achieve the goal of the Founding Fathers, and extend U.S. control over the whole hemisphere. And that was done very fast. They were unceremoniously dismissed from Latin America, which was our little region over here, as the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, called it. Now, the problem was, what happens in Latin America? Well, that problem, we now know a lot about that, big declassified record and so on. In February 1945, before the war was even over, there was a big conference in Mexico of Latin American countries and the United States to settle this problem. And the United States presented what it called an economic charter for the Americas, and it had to ram it through. But it was a big battle. The battle was that as the State Department pointed out, the Latin American countries were pursuing what the State Department called the philosophy of the new nationalism. And the philosophy of the new nationalism had two basic points to it. One is that countries should carry out internal development for internal needs, meaning the highest priority of economic development should be the people of that country. And secondly, that this development should attempt to extend the benefits of development to the population at large. So you try to, as much as possible, have a fair distribution of the wealth produced under development. Those are the principles of the new nationalism. The United States was flatly opposed to them. The U.S. position was that we must destroy what's called economic nationalism, these two principles. We must destroy economic nationalism in all its forms. The highest priority for development is not the people of that country, it's the rights of U.S. investors. The economies can develop only in ways which will be complementary to the U.S. economy, meaning no manufacturing that might compete with U.S. manufacturing. They'll be basically raw material producers. They'll make available cheap labor. In later years, it became they'll provide other amenities like tourism and opportunities for export pollution and havens for money laundering for New York banks and things like that. But essentially, they have to develop in a way that's complementary to the needs of the industrial economies. And any of you who've ever taken an elementary economics course know how to say all this in polite three-syllable words. You bring up comparative advantage and international specialization of labor and efficiency and so on. There's a game that you're taught that explains this. The U.S. of course won. Given the relations of power, the U.S. won, and you can see the results. In fact, if you want to have a recent look, the World Bank came out with a study about 2 or 3 days ago, in which it described the great dangers in Latin America. It concluded that Latin America has the most unequal distribution of wealth in the world, and the World Bank said this is going to lead to total chaos and disaster, meaning for Western investors, unless governments do something about it, because the whole place is going to blow up. So therefore, they better do something about the results of this success in having prevented the philosophy of the new nationalism, which tried to extend the benefits to the population at large and carry out independent development. That generalizes over the world, and furthermore, it goes back hundreds of years. There's nothing new about it. It goes back to the earliest Britain, of course, in those days. The earliest experiment with these ideas, actually was called an experiment, was in Bengal in the 18th century, and it destroyed the place. Bengal was the first place colonized. It was regarded as a paradise. It was comparable to England in its manufacturing level. In fact, Dacca was called the Manchester of India. It was rich, populous, resources, food, high quality cotton, all sorts of things. The other colony first established was, of course, Hispaniola, Haiti now. Again, populous, wealthy, heavily huge, probably maybe the densest population in the world, regarded again as kind of a paradise. They're both the absolute symbols of disaster. Dhaka, the Manchester of England, is now the capital of Bangladesh. Haiti, I don't have to talk about. And the reasons are well understood. The economies were destroyed while England and France despoiled them. And they were destroyed by essentially what's now called structural adjustment. The same policies were applied in Egypt to block an early industrial development in Egypt in the 19th century, which the British then wouldn't tolerate. It was competitive. And the story just goes on. I mean, there's no time to run through the whole thing, but that's the way it works constantly. There's nothing new about this. The countries that were subjected to market discipline, like India, Egypt, Ireland, another colony, third world today, well, take a look at them. The countries that developed, Britain, the United States, the rest of Europe, later Japan, which notice is the one country of the third world which escaped colonization, and not by accident is the one country to have joined the rich men's club with some of its former colonies in tow. They developed, and they all developed the same way, namely by radically violating these rules. They all were strong developmentalist states, powerful intervention, goes right up to the present. The market discipline, economic rationality, all comparative advantage, these have always been understood as fetters for the weak, cast aside by the strong when they feel like it. That remains true today. The call for a market economy has the same dual character it always had. Poor are going to have to subject themselves to it, now both at home and abroad. The rich won't consider it for a moment. They want powerful interventionist states to support them and support their wealth and so on. That's an old, old story. Well, a lot to say about that, but a few remarks about the stability of the principles. They are very, very stable and quite understandable. What about the, well, let's turn to the more narrow question of the present day, a few specific topics and the changes in contemporary world order. Let's begin with Mr. Clinton. Clinton is what's called a New Democrat. A New Democrat, by that it meant he came from the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. That is the wing of the Democratic Party that's even more pro-business than the norm. It's the part of the Democratic Party, New Democrats are people who have liberated themselves from these mushy liberal cliches about entitlement and redistribution and not selling arms to tyrants and murderers, peace dividend, and all that kind of outmoded nonsense. In fact, they pride themselves on having freed themselves from all of that. They are essentially moderate Republicans. The Clinton campaign slogan, and the popular book that they put out, you recall, was entitled "Mandate for Change," a phrase that they borrowed from Dwight Eisenhower. And the choice was symbolic. The mandate for change is intended to mean business as usual, of course. Now, when I say that they're moderate Republicans, I don't want to suggest that there's no differences. So there's some rhetorical differences. So instead of 1,000 points of light, we hear, politics of meaning and a couple of other things like that. But essentially, the story is the same. It's not the crazed ultra-right wing of the Republican Party. It's the more or less liberal internationalist wing of the Republican Party, which is openly pro-corporate, pro-business, makes no pretenses, and the New Democrats represent the understanding that you must be pragmatic and be openly a business party. Now, again, there are changes beyond the rhetoric. So you can find a few substantive issues in the last election. In my opinion, the most important substantive issue had to do with the question of what's called these days industrial policy. Now, industrial policy means the use of state power to interfere with the economy in such a way as to target particular industries and support them and keep out others and so on, and so keep out foreigners and all that sort of business. Now, that's supposed to be something that bad guys do. The rhetoric is, we believe in the free market and so on. There's all those bad guys out there who have industrial policy. As I mentioned, from the earliest days of the American Republic, the United States has had a powerful interventionist developmental state, and if we had followed any other principles, we would still be pursuing our comparative advantage in exporting furs. So, for example, the earliest you may have seen the other day, New York Times ran a front-page story called, Primer on Free Trade or something, which was supposed to teach the stupid masses why free trade is such a great thing and why you have to have international specialization of labor and comparative advantage and economic efficiency. And they lined up a whole bunch of, a couple hundred economists to explain these trivialities. And there's something right about them. I mean, if you've studied a economics course and you take a look at the model, there's kind of, the lines follow one another in the proofs. A number of things were not said, however. For example, those principles which, as the article pointed out, go back hundreds of years, that's entirely correct. So therefore they apply, say, to New England in the 1820s. And if the principles had been followed in New England in the 1820s, it would have instantly cut off the early stages of industrial development in the United States. It's been estimated that about half of the new industries, textile mostly in those days, would have failed instantly if they hadn't set up very high protective tariffs to block much cheaper British imports. This goes right through the century. Late 19th century, Andrew Carnegie was able to build up the first billion-dollar corporation behind very high protectionist wall steel to block much cheaper British steel. And it goes right up till today. I mean, the reason why we have things like, say, computers is because the public paid for them. They were not marketable in the 1950s. They're too big and clumsy and that sort of thing. Accordingly, the public paid about 100% of the costs of research, development, and production. In the 1960s, they became marketable, and then the industry was handed over partially to private enterprise. Private enterprise means you get the profits are privatized, the costs are socialized. The public continued to pay about 50% of the cost. In fact, by 1958, about 85% of all our research and development, R&D in the United States, was being funded by the Pentagon. That's that's the way we force the public to pay these things. It's perfectly true that Star Wars isn't a weapons system, but interestingly, I don't think anybody ever knew it was, thought it was. If you go back to the way Star Wars was sold to the business community, and if you look back at what people like, say, Robert Reich and the Clinton administration were writing then, you find complete awareness that this is a form of industrial policy. This is a way of funding, of funneling public resources into advanced industry. In fact, the OECD, the Club of Rich Countries, did a study in 1985 in which they compared U.S. expenditures for Star Wars, how they're being distributed, with the distribution of expenses by Japan's state ministry, MITI, the industry that sort of organizes, that runs this state-run Japan economy, and they found that they were about the same. Reason, they're targeting approximately the same technologies. They know pretty much what's going to be, somebody's going to make money on in the next couple of years. In the U.S., you do it through Star Wars. In Japan, you just do it straight. One of the reasons why Japan became more successful in competition. If we want to develop lasers, we have to figure out, we start by saying, how could you shoot down a missile, halfway to Mars or something? And then maybe something comes out for the commercial market, in which case you give it to private enterprise to make money from. The Japanese just say, let's construct it for the commercial market, and since they're no dumber than we are, it's obvious how that game's going to end. The Pentagon support for chip manufacture, all semiconductors and chips and so on, are government operations. They're not developed by private enterprise like any other kind of high tech. Government means public operations, public pays. The DARPA, the Defense Research Agency, they were designing chips that would withstand nuclear explosions. Meanwhile, Japan was just designing chips. Well, okay, who's going to win that game? And it showed. What I'm getting at is this. Like every other country, we've always had industrial policy. But in the last half century, it's been hidden behind the Pentagon system. Industrial policy is a fancy way of saying the public pays the costs and the rich get the benefits. It's done through targeting industries, through paying the cost of research and development, through providing state-guaranteed markets for waste production, all sorts of ways. But it's basically a technique for funneling public resources without public input, like nobody votes on it or even knows that it's going on. Funneling public resources into selected parts of what will ultimately be the private enterprise system when you can make some money out of it. That's industrial policy. Everybody's got it. We do too. It was hidden behind the Pentagon. Now you got to get people to pay, and the way you got them to pay was the Russians are coming. Well, that's a problem. The problem started arising in the 1980s because it was clear that it was getting harder and harder to say that the Russians are coming. Reagan and Bush faced the problem. It's a deep problem, because we wouldn't have a high-tech industry if it wasn't for this public funnel. That's one reason why there's not going to be things like economic conversion or so on, or anything of that sort, until somebody figures out an alternative way to get the public to pay the costs. And the democratic way, like let's decide how we want to distribute our resources, that's ruled out because democracy itself is unacceptable. So you got to figure out some other way. That was a problem. The problem became very serious by the late 80s. You can see it being worked on. You know, if you read the presentations that are given by the White House to Congress, which are kind of amusing, every year around March or something, the White House presents Congress with a little glossy booklet written by some PR firm, which explains why we have to have a huge military budget next year. Well, for a long time, it was always the same pamphlet. You know, Russians are coming, you know, we need this, that, and the other thing, fill in the blanks a little differently. The first one that looked a little bit quite different, actually significantly different, was in March 1990. That was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, you know, even the most crazed maniac couldn't find the Russians coming. So the pamphlet was rewritten, the brochure was rewritten a little. The basic structure was the same. The bottom line was the same. You know, we still needed a bigger military than ever, and huge high-tech weapons, and what's called a defense industrial base, meaning, you know, plenty of money for high-tech industry and so on. But the argument changed. Now it wasn't because the Russians were coming. It was because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. That replaced the line that said the Russians are coming. We needed intervention forces, advanced basing for intervention forces. Remember, this is March 1990. Saddam Hussein is still George Bush's great friend and ally. These intervention forces had to be targeted at the Middle East, as in fact they have always been. The Middle East is the core of the energy wealth of the world, and the U.S. is going to keep it. That's like a major principle of world order, and it takes intervention forces. Why? Well, you know, for 50 years it was to fend off the Russians, but now it says the intervention forces have to be directed at the Middle East, where, I'm quoting, the threats to our interest could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. Oh, all of a sudden it turns out the Russians had nothing to do with this, which is true. You know, it was indigenous nationalism that was the problem all along, but now you got to admit it. In fact, one nice thing about the end of the Cold War is that it's introduced a good deal of clarity into discussion. If you want to see an example of that, I won't take the time to go into it. Have a look at the current issue of Foreign Policy, one of the two major foreign policy journals, the other is Foreign Affairs. Foreign Policy is called the liberal one, sort of. It's sometimes said that Foreign Affairs is the journal of the war criminals, and Foreign Policy is the journal of the future war criminals. I haven't quite made it in yet. But so that's the liberal journal. But they have, and it's a good journal, a lot of interesting stuff. The lead article this time is really worth a look. It says, well, with the Cold War over, the foreign policy elite has to become more open and honest about what we've always been up to. And what we've always been up to, it turns out, is ensuring that resources, raw material, cheap labor, and so on, all over the world are under our control. If the Russians are in the way, you've got to fend them off, but it's irrelevant whether the Russians are there or not. The problem still arises as before. It then says, the writers then say, you know, big foreign policy analysts, that they said, ironically, this sounds like a Marxist or rather a Leninist view of the way capitalism works, but that's kind of ironic. But that's the way it works, you know. That kind of clarity is being found all over the place, and in particular, it's being found with regard to industrial policy. So, and the military cover for it. Now, notice that that's kind of like an objective problem. Everybody has to face it. There has to be some way to compel the public to pay the costs of advanced industry without getting the benefits from it. That's the kind of core principle that's invariant. And the pretext is gone, so something new has to be found. And in fact, that issue did arise in the 1992 election. It was maybe the only major issue, at least that I could find. Both candidates were very much in favor of a powerful interventionist state and a protectionism and so on and so forth. But the Clinton people were a bit more forthcoming about the need to have an open, overt industrial policy, not hidden behind anything. Let's do it openly because we can't pretend any longer. The Republicans, somewhat more constrained by ideological fanaticism, couldn't do this quite openly, and that was indeed an issue, and in fact you found a rather unusual degree of corporate support for Clinton, probably mainly for this reason. There's another issue, even deeper in a way, which leads to the same conclusion, and that is that the cutting edge of industry has been shifting. And after the Second World War, and for about 20 or 30 years, it was primarily electronics-based. Electronics, aeronautics, all that kind of stuff, and the associated technologies like metallurgy and so on. Now, in the last couple of years, it's been shifting to biology-based industry. So genetic engineering and biotechnology and so on, which are expected to be hugely profitable, and much more central to human life than electronics. And electronics is a kind of a frill in comparison. Here we're talking about control over food, over health, over the possibility of life altogether, and it's expected that you really make a killing in this. But biology, in many ways, I should say, the biology-based industries in any event would be much harder to hide behind a Pentagon mask. And in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of internal discussion about the need for much more open and direct government intervention to get these off the ground and to ensure that U.S. corporations monopolize them and so on and so forth. Well, again, the Clintonites were somewhat more upfront about this, and that's the difference. So New Democrats and moderate Republicans aren't absolutely identical. They're similar, but very similar in principles, but slightly different in tactics. These changes also do affect the military budget. So the military budget always had last 50 years, had two basic components. One was the strategic nuclear system, very intimidating posture. The other was the intervention forces. Now, in reality, both of those systems were intervention forces. And in fact, if you look at the documentary record, it's stated very clearly. The main concern, the main reason for the intimidating posture, the strategic nuclear weapons, was to construct what was called a shield, or a nuclear umbrella, within which conventional forces could be used as instruments of, political and economic needs. The problem was, for an objective one, there was a deterrent. The Russians were out there, and there might be a Soviet counteraction somewhere if we did something. So therefore, we had to have this huge, intimidating posture to scare away anybody. Remember, the U.S. is a global power. It's intervening all over the world in places where it doesn't have conventional force advantages, and you got to make sure that nobody interferes, so you have to be very intimidating. So that's the strategic nuclear weapons component of the system, an umbrella, a shield behind which you carry out normal intervention. In this sense, all forces were intervention forces. That mix, obviously the mix is going to change. The deterrent is gone. There no longer is a serious deterrent. As a result, the mixture of forces is going to change, much more for direct intervention forces, less concern with fending off a possible deterrent. And you see that in the Aspen budget. So now we're going after, rogue nations, current ideas to build the Pentagon so that it'll be able to fight a two-war scenario based on the idea that Iraq conquers Saudi Arabia while we sort of sit there not knowing what to do, and meanwhile North Korea conquers South Korea, and we're just desperate. We got to be able to deal with those two problems simultaneously. You need to be, again, there's more clarity in both discussion and planning. We recognize that the enemy all along has been the third world, meaning anybody who doesn't follow the rules, and we got to have the capacity for forceful intervention to keep them in line. There's a lot to say about our relations to the first world countries too, but time is short, and I'll put that beside. Well, in any event, those are slight changes that take place, and if you like, that's a Clinton doctrine. The end of the Cold War has led to other tactical changes. Actually, they've been reported rather prominently in the press just in the last few days. So Thomas Friedman, the chief diplomatic correspondent at the Times, had an article a couple of days ago which was on the new Clinton doctrine, precisely this. And the headline was, U.S. Vision of Foreign Policy Reversed. So it's really radically changed, not just modified, but reversed. That's pretty impressive. And then he describes the essence of the new doctrine. And the essence of the new doctrine is that we can intervene where and how we choose with the Soviet threat gone. In other words, we don't have to worry about the Soviet deterrent anymore. Now we just intervene where we choose and how we choose. That's the reversal. Now, of course, I'm extracting it from the window dressing. This is all dressed up in humanitarian rhetoric and democracy and human rights and so on. But all of that is strictly meaningless, and I mean that in a very technical sense. That is, every policy that is proposed by any state in the world always has that window dressing. So it carries what's called zero information in the technical literature. It's like tacked on to any policy. Therefore, it tells us nothing. And when you throw it away, and history is enough to indicate that you don't take it seriously, so what's left is the new Clinton doctrine is now we can intervene freely without being concerned about any deterrent. Our hands are untied. The following day, there was an article by Elaine Sciolino, another New York Times political reporter, talking about another aspect of the new Clinton doctrine. This was an article about a White House panel on intervention, which came up with a new proposal, which is now going to be the guiding proposal. And if you look at the highlighted words, the papers pick out a phrase and then put them in big letters so you sort of get the point fast if you don't have much time. The highlighted words were, what's in it for us? Okay, so that means from now on, the new basic, and this was the basic issue confronted by the White House panel, from now on, no more altruism. So things have changed from the days when we created deserts and graveyards in Central America and Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world. None of that more nice guy stuff. Now we just ask, what's in it for us? That's the new intervention doctrine, and the foreign policy reversal is we can intervene freely wherever we feel like and in any way we want because there's no concern about the Russians. Well, that is, in fact, the new Clinton doctrine, at least as it's been presented, and quite plausibly. And again, let me stress, it's not in the least new. It's like an automatic consequence of the elimination of the deterrent of the Soviet Union. And it was pointed out years ago by people who had a brain in their heads. The New York Times, for example, at the end of every year, they run sort of think pieces, last couple of days on deep problems. And in 1988, they had one on the possible end of the Cold War. It wasn't quite definite then, but you could see it in the cards. It was written by Dimitri Simes, who's the senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Well, in the age of Orwell, you know what to expect. And you found it. The article was worth reading. I actually wrote about it at the time. And he sort of saw pretty much what was going on. He said, look, Soviet Union's fading, got problems. That's a problem for us. It means we're going to lose the pretext for a lot of what we do, but there's a silver linings in the cloud. If the Soviet Union really does disappear, as might happen, that's going to liberate American foreign policy from the straitjacket of superpower hostility. It's going to mean that there is no deterrent any longer. And furthermore, there's no space left for non-alignment. I mean, whatever you think about the Soviet Union, worse than the Nazis, nevertheless, the consequence of its existence was that there were choices. There was space for non-alignment. There was an area of potential independence for third world countries. You eliminate one of the two superpowers, that's obviously gone. And he said that's going to have obvious consequences. One consequence is that we can strangle the third world much more effectively. We can now take a harsher line on third world debt, on unwarranted requests for assistance, meaning any requests. We don't anymore have to sort of bow and scrape before the undeserving poor the way we've been doing in the past, because now they're just totally at our mercy. So we'll take a harder line on the third world. That's point one. The second and more important point is that military power is now more useful as a foreign policy instrument without fear of Soviet counteraction. Okay, that's the new Clinton doctrine. We can intervene how and where we choose because there is no concern that the Soviet Union might react somehow. Again, none of this has anything to do with Clinton. All of these these consequences of the decline of the deterrent and the decline of the space of for non-alignment were evident immediately in policy. So you remember the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, and can I have a glass of water? Yeah. Clinton celebrated this event by invading Panama a few weeks later to install a puppet. Bush, sorry, wrong. It's very, very hard to distinguish moderate Republicans from New Democrats. Yeah. Clinton just proved his manhood by sending missiles to bomb Baghdad. I got the wrong guy. Bush immediately invaded Panama right afterwards, installing a puppet government, which, as is by now openly conceded and was obvious at the time, couldn't stay in power without U.S. military force behind it. That's now conceded. The invasion itself was so traditional, that it barely gets even a footnote in history. I mean, it's just the kind of thing that happens all the time. But it did have some differences. For one thing, the pretexts were different. We weren't protecting ourselves from a Bolshevik attack. It wasn't like Grenada, where they had this air base that was going to destroy us. So here what we were doing was defending ourselves from Hispanic narco-traffickers who were going to destroy our city. So there was a new pretext. And the other thing that was different was, in fact, pointed out by Elliot Abrams, the Latin American specialist of the Reagan administration, who was, of course, very cheered by the invasion. And he said, this is the first time that we've been able to intervene freely in Latin America without concern for any Russian counteraction anywhere. I mean, obviously not going to block us in Panama, but they might do something somewhere else. Not anymore. Berlin Wall fell. We're free to do anything we like. The new Clinton doctrine is expressed by Elliot Abrams, notorious Elliot Abrams. Yeah, thanks. The next major military action was in the Gulf a couple of months later, and as everyone pointed out, this was common at the time, the U.S. and Britain were then able to put 500,000 troops in the desert and do anything they felt like from a military point of view because they knew there was going to be no reaction. 10 years earlier, they wouldn't have dared to do that. Well, again, the new Clinton doctrine. Let's turn to the current Middle East achievement, so-called peace process. A few words about that. There is a dirty little secret which is worth bearing in mind, and that is that for 20 years, roughly, U.S. rejectionism has blocked any peace process in the Middle East, anything. Every effort to try to develop a diplomatic settlement has been blocked by U.S. power and intervention. Now, when I say dirty little secret, I mean nobody's allowed to mention it. So the facts are suppressed. They're so deep down the memory hole you can't even dig them up anymore. And pretty soon they'll be written out of even scholarly history, probably. In any event, they're there. Throughout this whole period, there has been a certain area of very broad agreement about the form of a peace settlement. Namely, it should be based on UN 242, November 1967, Security Council resolution, which is an agreement among states. It says all states in the region must have the right to live in peace and security. It emphasizes the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by force and calls for withdrawal of Israeli occupying forces. It was interpreted at the time, including by the United States, as a call for full peace in exchange for full withdrawal. Now, by the 70s, the U.S. had changed its position on this from full withdrawal to partial withdrawal. That is, whatever amount of withdrawal Israel feels like. At that point, the United States separated itself from the world. That's 1971. But the big separation came later, in about the mid-70s, when the terms of settlement were changed in the international arena to include UN 242, which was never seriously in question, along with other UN resolutions. Now, these other UN resolutions call for the national rights of Palestinians. So by the mid-70s, the terms for a diplomatic settlement were a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized borders with all the wording of 242, so guarantees for the right and security of every state in the region and so on and so forth. On that, just about everybody was agreed. The Arab states, the PLO, the Russians, the NATO allies, the Third World, and so on. It was blocked by the United States. And blocked, I mean, we had to veto it at the Security Council, which threw the Security Council out of the diplomacy in 1976. We had to vote against it every year at the General Assembly. I mean, every year there was a vote on it. Votes were like, 150 to 2, United States and Israel. That essentially vetoed the General Assembly. We had to block initiatives from other countries, from the Arab countries, from Europe, from the PLO, from everybody, because we simply refused to accept that there should be Palestinian national rights alongside of Israeli rights. There was no issue about recognizing Israel's right to live in peace and security. That was essentially settled. Everybody agreed on that. The question was, what about the Palestinians who aren't mentioned in 242? This is an agreement among states. Well, so there's basically two questions that have been alive all these years. One is it just the rights of existing states or also the rights of the Palestinians? That's question one. So UN 242 alone or UN 242 plus all other resolutions. And secondly, what's meant by withdrawal? Does it mean, as the world understands, and as in fact the U.S. insisted up till 1971, withdrawal to the international borders, or does it mean such withdrawal as Israel and the United States choose to carry out, partial withdrawal in their interest? Those have been the two issues. I should say all of this story is out of history, but it's there. Since December 1987, a third issue has come up. December 1987, the Intifada started. There was open resistance to Israeli rule. And at that point, the U.S. split from the world on a third issue. And the question is, what is the status of resistance against military occupation? Well, there's an international position on this. This is, again, unmentionable. It has the wrong message, so you can't never report it, down the memory hole, but there's a fact. There is, in fact, a big UN resolution on it. 1986, I think, major UN resolution on terrorism, condemns terrorism in all its forms, a big attack on terrorism. It passed 153 to 2, United States and Israel. One country, Honduras, abstained, which means it's essentially unanimous, except for the United States and Israel. Why did the U.S. come out against a resolution on terrorism? Well, there was a paragraph there which was unacceptable. It said that nothing in this resolution infringes on the right of people to resist racist regimes and military occupation. And the U.S. refuses to accept that, just as, say, Nazi Germany would have refused to accept it in 1943, and for roughly the same reasons, if you think about it. So that resolution, now, when the Intifada came along, this became a real issue. Here's resistance against the military occupation. Well, the U.S. attitude, the official U.S. attitude was, stated immediately, that the U.S. regards the resistance to Israeli rule, which could be things like, say, refusing to pay taxes and so on, as terrorist acts against Israel, that's the phrase, and demands that they be terminated. In other words, no form of resistance to this military occupation is permitted. That's the third major issue on which the U.S. departed from the world. And when I say world, notice that there are very few exceptions. Now, that's the way it stood until the Oslo Agreement, the agreement which was just signed. And notice that that agreement accepts U.S. rejectionism totally, 100%. The permanent settlement, not the short-term one, but the permanent settlement, the one down the road, is to be based on UN 242 alone, not the other resolutions which call for Palestinian rights, rights of refugees, rights of self-determination, and so on. So the end result is 242 alone, exactly what the U.S. has demanded for 20 years while it's been blocking any peace process. On the matter of withdrawal, it was made clear and explicit at once that withdrawal will be partial. So the U.S. wins on that one. On the matter of the Intifada, It wasn't written into the agreement, but the exchange of letters between Arafat and Rabin makes that one explicit. Arafat takes responsibility for ending the Intifada, for ending any form of resistance to Israeli rule, for ending what the United States defines as terrorist acts against Israel, meaning resistance. With regard to the matter of withdrawal, there's a lot of loose talk, but if you look at the details, it's a little different. For example, it's commonly said that Israel pledged to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Well, that's not accurate. If you look, what they said is there's the two contradictory conditions in the agreement. One says withdraw, it actually doesn't even say withdraw, redeploy in the Gaza Strip. The other one says that Israel will maintain control over the Israeli settlements and any access to them. Okay, have a look at the map of the Gaza Strip and take a look at where the settlements are and draw a line around them. Well, a lot of different ways of drawing a line. But Israel could certainly claim plausibly that the line around its settlements, mainly Gush Katif in the south, would include roughly 40% of the coastline of the Gaza Strip, which is the only important part. Nobody cares about the desert. It's very narrow, a couple miles wide and mostly desert, but the coastline's valuable. And Israel could easily claim, whether they will or not, we don't know, that their withdrawal leaves out 40% of the Gaza Strip. So they will withdraw from the city of Gaza, it's kind of like the New York police force withdrawing from Harlem or something. They don't want to be shot at, in other words. But they could keep everything they want. Now, these Gush Katif settlements, especially in the south, they're very important for Israel. They produce a very substantial proportion of its exports, believe it or not. This is a desert, but they use a lot of water. In fact, they steal the water of the Strip, as Israeli commentators point out, and they use them for example, for producing almost half of Israel's tomatoes for export, and a large part of its flowers, which go to Europe and make a lot of money. There are big tourist hotels down there which have, artificial lakes and so on. There's a desert, recall. And there's no reason to believe any of that's going to be left. It's very easy to, in fact, there are new water pipes going in right now to those areas. And the Prime Minister, Rabin, has made it clear that they're a high priority. So as things, you can't predict the future, things could change. And in fact, what we do will have a big effect on what happens. I'll come to that. But as it stands, the agreement says Israel can basically takes what it wants in the Gaza Strip. If you look at the West Bank, the same story is true. If you look at the development plans for the West Bank, look where the roads are and where the settlements are and so on, you see that there has been a long-term plan, in fact it goes back to 1968, to integrate large parts of the West Bank into the Israeli economy while leaving out Palestinian population concentrations. So that's the way the big highways go and so on. You want to get from one Palestinian town to another, you often have to go through Israel, because that's where the roads go. What about the third area, Jerusalem? Jerusalem, which was illegally annexed over Security Council objection, is legally has three times the size of what it was before the 67 war. But that's misleading because when people refer to Jerusalem, they're referring to something called Greater Jerusalem. And if you look at Greater Jerusalem and you look at the infrastructure, meaning the water pipes, the sewage disposal, the roads, the settlements, everything else, that's a very substantial part of the West Bank. In fact, it includes several 100,000 Palestinians who, again, are often in corners. Well, Israel has no intention of withdrawing from Greater Jerusalem. The current plans are to take roughly what I just described, and if you've looked at the history, that's a version of a plan that the Israeli labor government proposed in the fall of 1968. It was then called the Alon Plan. Versions have changed over the years. The most recent version was actually proposed by General Ariel Sharon, the extreme right-winger, which happens to be very similar to what was just implemented, meaning there's a very broad consensus on this, with little details. But basically everybody agrees, look, we don't want responsibility for the population. We want them to administer their own affairs and survive as they may, and we want to take what's useful. What's useful is the resources, in particular the water. So Israel takes about 5/6 of the water of the West Bank, and about 1/3 of its own water comes from there. The usable land, the nice the nice suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which happen to be up in the hills around there, the Jordan Valley, and so on. That's the way development has been set up. You look at the settlement since the Labor Party started it back in the early 70s, it has been very heavily hydrologically motivated, as Israeli experts have been pointing out. That is, the settlements are very much planned in order to make sure that there's control of the water resources, which are very important. This is a semi-arid area. Well, that's the agreement as it now stands, with the PLO bringing in what amount to foreign forces, that is, forces trained in Jordan and so on, into places like Gaza. To control the situation. They will control the Intifada. It's very much back to the status quo. It's back to the situation roughly in the mid-'80s. Not entirely. There are differences. Some of those differences include possible opportunities. And this is going to depend, how those opportunities are met depends in a big way on what happens here. Crucially, the United States has blocked the peace process all along. It's now got what it wants. Been able to do this because of the quiescence of the American population, and there are a lot of openings, and all of that could change. So there's a big responsibility for anybody who cares about such things. How could all of this be achieved? I should say that strong supporters of Israel are very clear about this. So Thomas Friedman, again, quite accurately described the outcome in the Times as a Palestinian surrender. He said Arafat ran up the white flag. That's basically accurate. How did it happen? Well, it has a lot to do with the developments in the world system that we've just been talking about. Remember, while the U.S. could block any diplomacy, it couldn't institute its own rejectionist solution as long as the world was out there. Well, the world isn't out there anymore. The Soviet Union's out of the game. The Third World is out of the game, in part because, for two reasons, in part because of the end of non-alignment, a consequence of this, the fact that it's a unipolar world, and secondly, and more important, because of this huge catastrophe of capitalism that swept over most of the world in the 1980s and just ruined the Third World. It's now a disaster area. So the idea of some initiative is essentially finished from there. As for Europe, that's the matter of market control again. As for Europe, here the big change took place after the Gulf War. Europe did have independent initiatives. It was calling for a political settlement in the terms of the rest of the world. After the Gulf War, it stopped. In fact, the last vote in the General Assembly was December 1990. Up until then, it had been regular. Since then, none. The reason largely is that Europe essentially ceded the Middle East to the United States. Now, since the New World Order was established in 1945, the United States has demanded that the Monroe Doctrine extend to the Middle East, but it hadn't quite got there. Europe finally has accepted that. No longer any European independent initiatives. Europe is still permitted to implement U.S. rejectionist proposals, which in fact is what Norway did in August, but not the independent initiatives that had previously been developed in Europe, which had called for a political settlement. There's another factor, namely the serious decline in the PLO internally, which is a big story, but there's no time for that, and though it's very important. Michio or somebody talked about U.S. world dominance, which in many ways is even greater than it was before. That means without parallel in history, even more than 45 in many ways. That has a lot of dangers, but it also means a lot of opportunities. It means for the people of the United States, for us, what we do is much more important even than it's been before, when it was very important. I don't know how much more time I have, but how much more time do I have?
8 minutes.
5 or 8 minutes? Okay, well, I'm like about a third through, so let me just, no, it's okay. Let me just indicate what I would like to talk about, like if we had a lot of time. There's one general qualification that has to be made to everything I said, namely, everything I've just said is based on pure mystification. There's a standard mystification which claims that nations are the actors in world affairs. And I've been talking about, the United States and Russia and so on, and that's transparently nonsense. The point was first made clearly, as far as I know, by that well-known Marxist revolutionary Adam Smith, who pointed out that if you want to study anything about what's going on in the world, you have to undertake what is later called class analysis. So as he pointed out, colonialism and mercantilism, which he opposed, he said are very harmful to the people of England and have an absolutely grievous impact on everybody else. They're a disaster. But as he pointed out, they are very beneficial to the principal architects of policy, in his day, merchants and financiers. In other words, the guys with power carry out policies using state intervention, which are fine for them. They may hurt everybody else, including the people of their own country. And therefore, if you really want to talk about policy, you don't talk about nations. You talk about the rich and powerful folk in the rich and powerful nations. They're the ones who are implementing policy. The nations may suffer, in fact, commonly do. That's, in fact, a lot of the history of imperialism is a history of the costs imposed on the population of the imperial powers for the benefit of the wealthy in the imperial powers and to the disaster of everybody else in their way. And suddenly this carries over to the victims. So in the third world victims, although they're usually wiped out, there's a sector who profits very nicely. In fact, they live very richly, in fact, and they're the ones tied into the dominant powers. So to be serious about international affairs, it's even obviously more complicated than this, but you have to at least make the distinction between the principal architects and the population. And when you talk about nations, that's just mystification. They're not actors in the world arena. And that's going to be true of every state in which power and privilege are concentrated in some fashion, meaning every really existing state, certainly, to borrow a familiar phrase. Well, that's always been true. It remains true today, and now that truism takes some new forms, which are quite important. Here we get to the big change in the international system. It goes back to about 20 years, early 70s. There has been a huge increase in unregulated capital around the world. It's now, according to the latest World Bank estimate, reached $14 trillion. I don't know what that number means, but it totally overwhelms every national economy. That's unregulated international capital. That capital is used differently than it used to be in a very dramatic way. So around 1970, international capital, with about 90% of it, was used for foreign exchange transactions, were used for long-term investment and trade, 10% for speculation. Those figures have been roughly inverted. It's a conclusion from John Eatwell, one of the leading specialists on international finance. Maybe you could argue about the numbers, but the changes are dramatic. Another change is that there has been an enormous increase in the internationalization of production. It's been going on for a long time, but it zoomed upward in this period. All of these things are related, but they are extremely important. They just change the whole rules of the game. One consequence of them, which Eatwell in fact has stressed, is that they lead to a sharp decline in economic growth. There's been a very sharp decline in economic growth all over the world in the 70s and the 80s, very likely traceable to the big shift from productive use of capital to financial speculation and, yuppie fun and games and all that kind of business. Another consequence is that national economic policies are becoming virtually impossible. The reason is that there's just too much control in the hands of these guys who have that $14 billion, $1 trillion out there. And they are going to insist upon deflationary policies. And if they don't like your policies, you pull out a little bit from the bond market and you're stuck. That certainly holds. European countries just can't even defend their own currencies any longer, as we've seen. With regard to the United States, which is still the biggest guy on the block, it's very, you could argue about it, but it looks unlikely, it certainly would be a problem for the United States to carry out policies which would not satisfy international investors, financial speculators, of whom many are American, of course, but remember, their interest is not the country. Their interest is their pocketbook, which is some totally different thing, and their power. So, say, Clinton toyed with this minuscule stimulus, too small to even be noticeable, and it was instantly shot down, and probably this is a lot of the reason. Well, that's a big issue. Another consequence of all of this is that the one consequence of the internationalization of production is that you also internationalize the third world model. Now, the third world model is a very distinctive model. If you've ever traveled to a third world country, it strikes you very quick. there's a sector of extremely wealthy and privileged people, ones who are doing the work for the guys overseas. And there's a huge mass of people who are superfluous, miserable. You got to control them. They're dying, starving, and so on. That's roughly the third world model, two-tiered. You want to see what it looks like, take a walk in New York or Los Angeles, because we're getting more and more like that. Now, this is still a very rich country, we're not Haiti. But we're going in that direction. And we are, in fact, going in that direction more rapidly than the other industrial countries, even though we are the richest. Take a look at the latest UNICEF study on child poverty that came out a couple of days ago. You'll notice that the U.S. is off the map on the industrial world. We're far worse on this measure than any other industrial country. The reason we're the only one without health care, and we're still not going to have it after these shenanigans are done. That's another reflection of it. In fact, in many ways, this is true, and it's because the reasons are easily understandable for a whole lot of complicated historical reasons. In fact, there's a fact, which is that the United States is much more a business-run society than other industrial societies. It's a very free society, much more free than any of the others, but also much more business-run. No labor unions, violent labor history, no social contract, so on. Well, we're moving in that direction, and so is the rest of the world, but behind us, the rest of the industrial world. And the mechanisms are completely obvious. Actually, they were pointed out by the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago. They had a big front-page story which noted a development that they called of transcendent importance, so not slight. The result of transcendent importance was that U.S. wages were now lower than those of our competitors. In fact, the only country that had done better than us in smashing the labor force was Thatcher, England, the other great revolution that everyone likes. She'd done even better. But as compared with, say, Germany and Italy and so on and so forth, we had managed to drive down wages below even, like Italy and so on and so forth, and that's terrific because now there are better opportunities for profit. And, of course, it drives you naturally towards the third world model. The same happens as a result of the internationalization of production, the ability to transfer capital abroad very fast and to put production in one place and so on and so forth, which you all know about. That has obvious consequences. So take, say, GM, the biggest corporation. As you know, it's planning to shut down a couple of dozen operations in the United States. Meanwhile, it's become the biggest employer in Mexico, and it's now moving to the new third world in the East, which is even better in a lot of ways because you get a highly trained workforce, very educated, also, white and blue-eyed and that sort of thing, and they work for nothing, especially as the economic reforms go in, they're in total disaster. So you read the international business press, say the Financial Times, you get headlines like "Green Shoots in Communism's Ruins," meaning communism is a wreck, but there's some green shoots. Some things look good. The green shoots are that with the pauperization of the population and the sharp rise in unemployment as a result of the economic reforms that are being rammed through, you can get extremely cheap labor. Like in Poland, you can get workers for 10% of the wages of what they call the pampered West European workers. Turn to Business Week, and they explain that the Western workers are going to have to understand that you have to eliminate luxurious social programs and what's called immobility of labor, meaning you get a job. It's a fancy way of saying you have a job. All of these crazy things are going to have to go. That's what the New Democrats understand, because there are now ways of making profit that don't care about you, So you're not needed for production anymore. I mean, we can go produce in places with very high repression areas where there's very low wages and where people are being pauperized thanks to the economic reforms we're ramming down their throats. So we don't need you guys anymore, unless you, of course, are willing to drive your wages down. That's the result of transcendent importance. They're doing it. What this means is, in effect, that you can now put the screws on the poor at home as well as on the poor abroad. Poor means an awful lot of people, in fact, a big majority of people. They are now victims, Once we get away from the mystification of nations being, agents in world affairs, we see very much what Adam Smith described, but much more sharply than in his day. Namely, the principal architects of policy are now able to have a really grievous impact on their own population by a variety of devices of the kind that I described, which are just consequences of changes in the international economy. Now, back in the days of a more national economy, like, say, the 1920s, Henry Ford understood that unless you pay your wages, your workers something, like, say, $5 an hour, they're not going to buy your cars, and then you're not going to be able to produce. In a more global economy, it's not obvious, but it's not clear that argument holds any longer. It's possible that you can have production in very highly repressed cheap labor areas and oriented towards the wealthy sectors in the international community, namely the wealthy in the rich societies, who are a fairly substantial group, and the wealthy in the small societies, who are the poor societies, who are very wealthy and big consumers, but a smaller group. Well, that's more of the internationalization of the third world. Coming home, you see it in every American city. It leads to what the business press, the New York Times business pages, called the paradox of 92. Big problem. I can't understand it. The paradox of 92 was that the economy is going down, but profits are going up. Big paradox. Yeah, sure. That's straight out Adam Smith. Well, power in this world of a more internationalized economy, power is moving into the hands of transnational corporations and international finance. Again, the figures are pretty dramatic. I don't know if I have them here somewhere. Yeah, foreign sales. There's recent World Bank studies on this. Foreign sales of transnational corporations are now greater than all of world trade. Furthermore, what's called world trade is kind of a joke. Maybe a third or 40%, nobody knows exactly, of what's called trade, meaning interactions across borders, is actually intra-firm, meaning it's within a single firm, like it's Ford Motor Company moves something from one place to another place. That's no more trade than if you own a grocery store and you move a can of beans from here to there. It's a centrally managed interaction with a very visible hand, which just happens to cross a border. But it's not trade in any serious sense. And that's not a small quantity. It's like maybe 40% or something like that. Plus the fact that this dwarfs the foreign sales of multinationals now happen to exceed and will soon totally dwarf even this kind of trade. And then I mentioned the things about speculation. These numbers are not small. They're big. It means that the world economy doesn't even have a remote resemblance to a classical market. It's not that it deviates a little. It's just not even remotely resembling it. Some people have called it a world of corporate mercantilism, centrally managed interactions.
There was a brief interruption to change the tape.
Governing institutions have tended to coalesce around domestic power. Recent centuries, mostly economic power. So national states have sort of coalesced around, domestic economic power. And that phenomenon is still going on, except now it's transnational power. And you're getting new governing institutions which reflect it, transnational in scale. So take corporations. They are governing institutions. They do what they feel like. They have the great advantage that they are purely totalitarian, much more so than any totalitarian state. So power in a corporation is top-down, strictly, owners ultimately and investors, and the outside population has nothing to say about it. You and I have nothing to say about what's done by a transnational corporation. So it's pure totalitarianism and very big. The numbers I was tossing around give some indication, but extremely big. On top of that, they're developing their own institutions, like the IMF or GATT or NAFTA, for that matter, or the G7, executive meetings of the rich 7 countries and so on. In fact, the financial press calls that a de facto world government, Financial Times, and that's quite a good name for it. Now, this de facto world government has great advantages. For one thing, it works completely in secret. It's totally insulated from any public pressure or even public knowledge. Who knows what's going on in the GATT negotiations? You can find out, sort of, if you spend your life, reading technical monographs, which you can't find. But as far as the public is concerned, you're basically out of it. NAFTA was quite dramatic in that respect. It was kept secret, executive agreement kept secret, very hard to find out what's in it. But notice that this overcomes a big problem which arose at the time of the 17th century English Revolution. The rabble were getting involved in things which are none of their business, like how to manage public affairs. Okay, now you've got a way of eliminating that. Yeah, there'll be less than that. You can eliminate that. You can eliminate the rabble completely because they don't even know what's happening to them. You can't have an opinion on the latest GATT negotiations, or what went on at the latest IMF meeting, or what's going on in some executive suite, because you don't even know what it is. How can you have an opinion if you don't know what it is? Furthermore, you couldn't do anything about it if you did have an opinion. There's no institutions that can affect it. All of this is going on apart from any parliamentary institutions. They themselves are very limited and, of course, reflect private power, but at least they exist. And all of this separates them even further from the exercise of power. So you have a very sharp attack on democracy of a very welcome kind. That's why elites are so much in favor of this. And notice you can continue to have electoral processes in which you can decide, let's say, between a moderate Republican and a New Democrat occasionally, knowing that they're going to do all the same things, in part because they are straight representatives of this community, and for another reason because the range of political choices has been very much narrowed, given where power is shifting to in the international arena. Well, these are all very important events. Market controls can now be used to discipline the poor, and that means the poor at home as well. That's what it means to say, cut down on welfare and so on. You poor guys, you live in the market, right? We rich guys, we're going to use state power to keep us rich, an interventionist state. Now, that's always been true, but it's becoming more dramatically true today. There's a lot of things that ought to be talked about. I'll just name them and won't even discuss them, but say, take NAFTA. NAFTA is called, you can have whatever. First of all, when people talk about NAFTA, remember they're talking about a particular version of NAFTA. North American Free Trade Agreement could mean a million different things. There's one particular version of it crafted by the three state executives in secret, and that's what people call NAFTA. I mean, plenty of people are in favor of NAFTA, a North American Free Trade Agreement, and are against this, but that's a hard point to make when, the ideological system works the way it does. Any event, let's take this version of NAFTA. Well, you can argue about whether it's good or bad, but two things are unarguable. It's not a free trade agreement. First of all, it's not free, and secondly, it's not about trade. It's highly protectionist, and in fact, that's been pointed out in criticism by people who really advocate free trade, and in favor by corporate executives. Like I happened to be driving home from work the other day and punishing myself by listening to All Things Considered, and they had we don't have WBAI up in Boston, so do I get something for that plug? Thank you. They were interviewing some Xerox executive who was like everybody, telling how great NAFTA is. But if you bother to listen to what he was saying it's great because it's protectionist. It's great because it's going to be a way for us to create a protected market which will keep out those Asian-based and European-based industries. And that's done by very complicated rules of origin requirements, which take up about 10% of the whole NAFTA text, which are designed for exactly these protectionist reasons. And this is all over you read the economics journals, they're all full of this. It's not, it's certainly not free. Furthermore, it's highly protectionist in the proposals that are instituted. Like one of the main things that the U.S. succeeded in ramming through in NAFTA and is trying to ram through in GATT is what's called intellectual property rights. Fancy term. What that means is guaranteeing, protecting the technology of the future, setting up high protectionist barriers to ensure that the technology of the future will be in the hands of U.S.-based, or, if other guys can get in the act, their corporations. It means, increasing patent regulations and control over software and, control over biotechnology discoveries and so on. It's not a small matter. That kind of protectionism is estimated to yield maybe, if it passes, as it has in NAFTA, something like $61 billion a year in funds flowing from the third world to the United States. That's the International Trade Commission estimate. Serious business, in other words, but of course protectionist. Notice that the currently rich countries, like the United States and England and Japan and so on, Germany, they never accepted these rules. The United States never accepted such protection when we were a developing country. But now we've got the power, so other guys have to accept it to make sure they don't get into the act. That's the standard technique, not only for economic liberalism, but even for the new protectionism, such as this, which is a major thing in NAFTA. Quite beyond the fact that this has nothing to do with being free, it also has very little to do with trade. Intellectual property has nothing to do with trade. The agreements that say U.S. banks can operate in third world countries, and of course immediately swamp all competitors because of their size, that has nothing to do with trade. That's just a way of destroying the possibility of carrying out a national economic planning in any other country. So in fact, the whole agreement, if you look at it, and GATT sort of the same, is some kind of mixture of liberalization and protection designed to ensure the power of the principal architects, very much as Adam Smith would have said. The principal architects want to control the technology of the future, the wealth of the future. They want to be able to grind people down at home and abroad with great effectiveness, and that's what these agreements are for. Well, you can argue about whether you like it or you don't like it, but we might as well remember what it is. To take another major problem, and here just one sentence, takes a health, huge issue. We're told that we're supposed to pay attention to Clinton's 6 stars. That was what we're supposed to debate, Clinton's 6 stars. Well, there's a 7th kind of little bit of light there, which we're not supposed to discuss, and that is that all of the programs under consideration are highly regressive, meaning Lee Iacocca and whoever empties his wastebasket pay the same amount. In fact, if you really look at the details, Lee Iacocca pays less because he's got the fancy tax lawyers who tell him how to get tax rebates, and as the employer's costs get taken out of wages, as they will, they won't get taken out of his wage and so on. But even taking it at face value, it's radically regressive. Every nationalized program of whatever type is as progressive as the tax system is. Not very, but at least something. That's a crucial fact. And furthermore, as indeed is pointed out, these plans, whatever they are going to give plenty of, they're going to leave things in the hands of big insurance companies who rake off their profits and spend a ton of what they get in advertising and have huge salaries for CEOs and so on. And of course, there'll be huge administrative waste and so on. Nevertheless, the core issues and the reasons why no national health plan can be considered in the United States is that it doesn't permit, it's not regressive, doesn't soak the poor, and any more than the tax system does, which is some, but not as much as this is. And secondly, it doesn't leave anything for the big corporations, like the insurance companies. So it's just marginalized. That's not that a small part of the population is off the agenda here. Poll after poll shows that a substantial majority of the population is off the spectrum. In fact, has been since the mid-40s, but that doesn't matter in countries where you can ram through policies in a business-run electoral system. Well, those are also big issues. All right, let me just end. I think we can see where things are going. There are big questions about how far can it go. So, for example, will it be possible to construct an international society on this basically third world model, meaning islands of wealth and privilege and a huge sea of misery, with pretty big islands in a rich country like this, but nevertheless that structure? Will it be possible to maintain what amount to totalitarian controls of decision-making, increasingly, under a kind of facade of electoral democracy? Will popular resistance, which is going to increasingly have to be international in scale itself, will it be able to succeed and to dismantle these evolving structures of domination and violence? Those are the big questions of the future, and they are more in our hands than ever before because of the increasing power of the United States. Thanks. Sorry, I went so far.
Thank you, Noam. We're going to move to a brief period of questions and answers. We need to end in exactly 25 minutes. The entire program will air tomorrow on WBAI at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening from 7 to 9. It will be on the Pacifica Network next week. Before we move to the questions, I would just like to acknowledge, with thanks, the involvement of a number of people who made today's program possible. Valerie Van Isler, the station manager of WBAI. Art DeLugoff, who has once again made the Village Gate available to us for these kinds of programs. A number of special guests in the audience, including Bill Schaap, Ellen Ray, and Ari Ben-Menashe, authors of one of the more significant books analyzing the Israeli intelligence networks operating today. A number of other guests in the audience. We're not going to take the time to acknowledge everyone, but thank you all for coming. We're going to move to questions. I'd like to get the house lights on if we can. There we go. So we can at least see who is going to be called on. Let me caution you about two things. One is I'm going to be ruthless on the time of questions. This is not a time for speeches, but a time for questions of Noam Chomsky and or Michio Kaku. We do have a very stringent time deadline. Secondly, we don't have very good technology because of the enormous crowd that's here today. We don't have a mic in the audience. What I'm going to ask you to do is call out your question and then wait, and I will repeat the question, which also is another cue that it should be short and sweet. So that it can be repeated on the mics for air. If I can we get the lights up a little more? I can't see a thing. No. That's it? Okay, then we go with what we have. Right here in front.
Mr. Chomsky, great everything. I will dance you up on how wonderful you are, but no matter how wonderful you are known by very few people. Hardly anyone knows your name, and I've talked to you. Can you be a little ethical? And I'm not trying to be frivolous. Go on the Winfrey show and I slept with the chicken. I'm a transsexual.
The question was for Noam Chomsky how he can get his name out and his analysis out a little further.
Can I get on the Oprah Winfrey show and say I slept with a chicken? Well, actually, that almost happened once, not quite. And it shows you what the problems are. Phil Donahue, who's one person who has tried to get me on now and then. Once I happened to be down in Managua, and he set up a show which had a satellite hookup and that sort of thing. And I was sitting there in this naturally non-air conditioned, 150-degree Managua, not even studio, sitting under the satellite, not being able to hear what was coming across and so on. But every once in a while I could pick up a few words, and all I could get out of this program, occasionally I'd say something, but what I could get out of this program was that something was being shown about how often they had shown transvestites on programs that were supposed to deal with world affairs or something. There's no way to break through this. We have to set up our own media, We have to go around the media. We have to have modes of communication that aren't, that don't depend on private power. And we have to do exactly what Michio said. Their private power is like state power is subject to the popular will, in the sense that if you make things too rough for them, they adapt. And there are ways to change the institutions. Take, say, the media. I spend a lot of time criticizing them, but the fact is they're a lot better than they were 30 years ago. And part of the reason they're a lot better is it's a better country than it was 30 years ago. Things have changed in the country. A lot of people care about things. People who did care about these things have sometimes worked their way into the media. Like there are a lot of people, everybody's got people out there who came through what we call the 60s experience, which is really a 70s and 80s and everything else experience. And, and they just have to adapt to their, to the rabble. And there are things we can do, but it's not going to be to play their game. That's hopeless.
Yes.
Yeah. If Professor Chomsky, as you say, the multinational corporations are really running their own long and they can move around and move out men and do anything they want to punish people, then why is NAFTA even necessary?
Yeah.
And I'd like to add to that.
Yeah.
That NAFTA is regional, and if nation states are no longer valid, then why is it a regional, tri-national state? It seems to me that what we're going to get are regional conglomerates. And that brings up something you didn't mention, and that is the danger of war.
Thank you. The question was why, if we're dealing with multinational corporations and that level of power, why do we need something like NAFTA to orchestrate this? And additionally, if we're dealing with the regional aspects of it, how is the danger of war emerging through processes like that reflected in NAFTA?
Well, first of all, remember, multinational corporations are not omnipotent. In fact, we just saw that in Michigan, I guess, where public pressure operating through the courts forced General Motors not to transfer a factory abroad, claiming, on the grounds that this was really a public enterprise because of all the public effort that went into it, including the workers and everything else. So there's a lot of, that's one thing, but they're by no means all powerful. With regard to the regionalization, it is absolutely true, in fact, been pointed out, that a lot of the corporate support for NAFTA, as against GATT, is that U.S.-based corporations benefit from it, whereas in GATT, whatever profits come out of it are distributed worldwide. And U.S.-based corporations, of course, are moving towards a world economy, but they're still U.S.-based. Nations haven't disappeared, and nation-states haven't disappeared, and they're not likely to. Those are conglomerations of power, which will be used by international corporations, international finance, and the ones that are U.S.-based want to be protected. So just like they want the Pentagon, or some equivalent, to be around to ensure a public subsidy to them in this country, they're going to want to gain advantages against their rivals based in Europe and Japan. Now, one likely consequence of NAFTA, not unlikely, I mean, if it goes through, and why do we need it? Frankly, I don't think it's going to change much of what's going on. Like movement of production to, say, Mexico. Mexico is called an economic miracle. Mainly because wages have been reduced about 60% in the last decade, and that means you got a lot, and there's no pollution controls that operate, and you can kill union leaders and so on. So sure, production is going to move to those areas, NAFTA or not, but NAFTA locks into place by treaty a certain particular kind of arrangement, which is designed to protect investor rights and not protect worker rights and environmental rights. The idea is to lock that arrangement into place so that some future democratizing tendency won't be able to change it. That's very important. So how many jobs will it lose or gain? It's almost meaningless. None of the economic models work. Everybody knows they don't work. You can believe what you like. But it will lock into place a certain specific form of international arrangement, namely regional, and designed to protect investor rights and not human rights. And that's very important to raise that to a treaty. You never know when democracy will come out somewhere. Will it lead to regional blocs? Very likely. I mean, if it ever goes through in anything like its present form, it will sooner or later encourage a European bloc, which already exists, and a Japan-based bloc, which already exists. And that will have harmful effects for American workers. But notice it's not going to harm that Xerox Corporation guy I quoted, because he's already got factories over there inside their blocks. American workers don't have jobs over there, but the Xerox Corporation guy, he has factories over there. So even if there's a set of blocks that retaliates, he's inside them already. So he's happy to get a step up from this protectionism, but he's not really harmed if other people set up their protectionism. That's another advantage that corporations have over people. Will it lead to war? I doubt it very much. I think that's very unlikely. And in fact, that's an extremely safe prediction. You can predict with it 100% security, for the very simple reason that if I'm wrong, there won't be anybody around to tell me that I'm wrong.
This woman in front.
Do you see anything positive coming out of the proposed health care
Current health care proposal?
The question was whether there's anything positive coming out of the current health care proposals.
Yeah, I mean, it'll offer some degree of protection to people who at the moment aren't protected. That's a benefit. If you compare it with what's around now, you could argue, okay, maybe slight improvement. If you compare it with what most of the population wants and with what the rest of the world has, it's just unbelievable. And it's extreme. I mean, for those of you interested in media analysis, it's very interesting to watch how this thing is being framed. I mean, I'll just give you one example. The last thing I saw in Boston Globe this morning had a big front page story on healthcare, which by two very nice people, liberal reporters and stuff, who say down somewhere, 30th paragraph kind of thing, they say, well, here the issues that we're talking about are the ones that are agreed on by advocates and critics alike, Now, the things that are agreed on by advocates and critics alike are Clinton's 6 stars. Now, what about the rest of the whole population? Well, they're not either advocates or critics. They're, not part of the human race. I mean, maybe they're anti-Americans. That's another category you're allowed. But they're certainly not, they're neither proponents nor critics. You're a proponent or a critic only if you accept the rules of the ideological game. And in fact, most of the discussion runs like this. For example, you just might ask yourself, how much have you seen in this huge coverage, which points out the trivial fact that all these programs are highly regressive? I mean, that's the most obvious thing that comes to mind at once. I don't even see anybody talk about it. That's off the agenda. But is it an improvement? Arguably. Actually, it's so complex, I haven't the foggiest idea what it's going to mean. And frankly, I think that's part of the point. It's been interesting to watch how it's been presented. For a couple of weeks now, we've been subjected to a huge PR campaign, which kind of works more or less like this. Front page headline, Clinton announces part of health plan, and then comes some long, complicated story you can't understand. And then the next day comes another part of the health plan, which happens to rescind about half of what they said the day before, just to confuse you totally, and you can't understand this new one, and then some new thing will come along. Well, I think the idea is to try to make sure that nobody sees what's happening to them, and what ends up happening to them could be marginally better for some people, marginally.
Over here.
Could you elaborate on something I heard in another space about how NAFTA is being used to discourage the single-payer program?
The question was how NAFTA is being used to discourage the single-payer healthcare program.
Oh, yeah, that's happening, and it's happening independent of NAFTA. Remember, a piece of NAFTA has already been implemented, namely the U.S.-Canadian so-called free trade agreement, which is, again, neither free nor trade. But within the framework of this free trade agreement, there are a lot of things going on. And if you want to predict what's happening in NAFTA, you should have a look. All of these agreements make it possible to challenge policies in the other country on grounds that they are interferences with free trade. And in fact, one of the things that the U.S. has been challenging, and Canada has given up on, they even gave up on it just because the agreement was impending, but it was under the force of the impending agreement, was the production of generic drugs. Now, you can produce drugs for like a fraction of the cost of what you buy and, you pay in the pharmacy, but of course the pharmaceutical corporations, which are pretty much publicly subsidized, they don't like that. They want you to buy the expensive stuff, not the generic drug. Now, one way that Canada has managed to keep down healthcare costs to an extent is by allowing production of generic drugs after some period, like a couple of years, 10 years or something. And the U.S. pharmaceutical corporations don't like that, and Canada, in fact, has given up on it. And that has the effect of harming very much the Canadian plan, because it means one big cost control part is gone. Now, that's important in the United States, because, so we always talk about it as a Canadian-style plan. I mean, why a Canadian-style plan? Why not the plan that exists, some version of which exists everywhere in the world except here? Well, the reason is, Canada, you sort of know it's there. I mean, France is, like maybe on Mars or something. But Canada's right sitting there. You can see it. I mean, people cross the border and so on. So it's a Canadian-style plan, and it's kind of embarrassing. It's kind of embarrassing to have a plan which, it's not all that great in my opinion, but in any event, it's, far better than what we have, much cheaper, works better and everything else. It's sitting right there. It's an embarrassment. And if we can make that inefficient and costly, it's better for a single-payer plan. This is the way the two things interact, I think.
Right here. Mm-hmm.
In a best-case scenario, how do you envision economic systems in a future, hopefully, that works?
The question was, in a best-case scenario, how does Professor Chomsky envision an economic system that works?
Well, this one works. It just works in the interests of the masters. And I'd like to see one that works in the interests of the population. And that'll only happen when they are the principal architects of policy, to borrow Adam Smith's term. I mean, as long as power is narrowly concentrated, whether in the economic or political system, you know who's going to benefit from policy. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. That's why democracy is a good thing. But, of course, democracy means completely dismantling the whole system of corporate capitalism, which is radically anti-democratic. And that can't be done by a stroke of the pen. It means building up alternative popular institutions, which will, in fact, allow control over investment decisions in the hands of working people and communities and so on and so forth. But sure, that's the way to go. Kind of participatory economy, as some have called it.
Yes.
We just went through a long experience with the anti-capitalism contract. It didn't work out very well. It tried and determined failed. And you're advocating the same old thing.
No, on the contrary.
Wait. Let's just get the question on. The question was whether Professor Chomsky is advocating what the questioner called the same old thing of the anti-capitalism that didn't work.
I presume you're talking about the Soviet Union. Exactly. Yeah, well, there's 2 points there. And Cuba. All right, fine. Let's take the Soviet Union. I'll talk about Cuba if you like, which is a separate case because, of course, they've been strangled. But the Soviet Union, there's 2 points to be made. First of all, that's basically a capitalist system. The first thing that Lenin and Trotsky did, remember, was to destroy all forms of socialist initiative in the country. I was just talking about participation in decision-making on the part of workers and communities, right? First thing that the Bolsheviks did was destroy that totally. They destroyed the workers' councils, they destroyed the Soviets, they eliminated the Constituent Assembly. In fact, every form of popular organization was dismantled at once. And they set up a command economy with wages and profits and so on a sort of a centralized state capitalist model. So on the one hand, what you're describing is just the extreme opposite of what I've just been talking about, not the same. Secondly comes another question. Whatever you think of that system, did it work or did it fail? Well, you see, in a culture with deeply totalitarian strains like ours, we always ask an idiotic question about that. The idiotic question is, how does it compare with Western Europe, say, or with the United States? And the answer looks pretty bad. But that question, a 3-year-old would know what's wrong with that. I mean, these societies haven't been alike for 600 years. I mean, you have to go back to the pre-Columbian period before East and West Europe were anything more or less alike. I mean, even before Columbus, they started breaking up, with Eastern Europe becoming Western Europe's third world. In fact, the World Bank has actually done some studies of this. If you look at the proportion of Eastern European income relative to Western Europe, you find that it declined until about 1913. Then it rose very fast until about 1950. So by 1950, the Eastern Europe proportion of Western European income was much higher. And then it kind of leveled off. In the mid-60s, when the Soviet economy started to decline, it started to decline a bit and decline a little bit more into the late 80s. After 1989, it went into free fall. It is now approximately where it was in 1913. Well, that tells you one thing about whether it succeeded or not. A second, now, if we asked a rational question, instead of asking an insane question, like how does it compare with Western Europe, suppose we asked a sane question, like how does it compare with, if you're interested in alternative modes of development, whether you like them or not, just how they worked, what you would ask is, well, let's take some societies that were like them, say, in 1910, okay? Now, history doesn't give precise analogs, but there's good choices. So we could say compare Russia and Brazil, or Bulgaria and Guatemala, let's say. Those are fair, reasonable comparisons. I mean, Brazil, for example, ought to be a super rich country. It's got unbelievable resources. It has no enemies. In fact, it's a lot better off than the Soviet Union. Compare, say, Brazil and Russia. That would be a sane comparison. Now, there's a good reason why nobody undertakes it, and we always ask idiotic questions. Because if you compare, say, Brazil and Russia, or Guatemala and Hungary and so on, you get the wrong answers. Brazil, for, say, maybe 5 or 10% of the population, indeed is like Western Europe. And for like around 80% of the population, it's kind of like Central Africa, and then the others are somewhere in the middle. In fact, for probably 80% of the Brazilian population, Russia would look like heaven, I mean, if a Guatemalan peasant landed in, Bulgaria, he'd probably think he'd gone to paradise. Well, therefore, we don't ask those questions. We ask stupid questions, which anyone who thinks for a second would see. I'm not criticizing you. I don't mean that. I really am not. I mean, everybody asks these questions. All the academics ask these questions. All the development economists ask these questions. The newspaper commentators ask them. But just think for a second. You want to know how that system worked? Well, compare it with something that was like it. Is that a brilliant insight? Trouble is, you can't do it. Now, the fact is, it was, in fact, just to end, because I'm told I'm talking too long as usual, the World Bank just gave its own analysis, 1990. And it described, the World Bank is not a radical outfit, they described Russia and China as relatively successful societies that developed by extricating themselves from the international market and finally ran into trouble and had to rejoin the system. But relatively successful, and as compared with the Third World, which they were like, very successful. In fact, that's exactly what the U.S. was worried about. If you read the declassified record, of which we have plenty, I mean, right into the 1960s, the concern was that Soviet development just looked too good. It was a model that the Third World wanted to follow because it was doing too well.
There was an additional part to the question on Cuba.
Cuba? Okay.
No, excuse me. We're not taking any more questions right now. There was an additional part on Cuba. No matter.
Well, on Cuba, you can't even discuss the issue. I mean, Cuba has been subjected to 30 years of massive terror, economic strangulation. For years, it was on the pretext that it's a Russian outpost, which is total fraud. In fact, the decision to destroy the Cuban government was taken in March 1960. That's declassified. At a time when there weren't any Russians in sight, the U.S. government regarded Castro as anti-communist and assumed that the population, their studies showed that the population was strongly in support of him, so that decision had an addition. It said we have to overthrow the government in such a way that the U.S. role is not found because of the popularity of the government. After the Russians are gone, if you believe any of the propaganda you've read in the last 30 years, we ought to stop the strangulation of Cuba. What did we do? We tightened it under the influence of Bill Clinton, incidentally. Bush signed a worse blockade under pressure from Clinton, who was demanding even worse. Okay? That's after the Russians are gone. And it shows, again, any rational person what this is about. But, again, you could talk about whether you like Cuba, you hate it, or anything else. But you can't even raise the issue as to whether it's a successful developing economy. I mean, nobody could develop under those conditions.
In the back.
Our
question was the U.S. presence in Somalia.
Well, I actually wrote about this last December, if you're interested, and I think what's happened more or less demonstrates it. I mean, look, the U.S., if the U.S. had any, it's called a humanitarian intervention. I mean, if the U.S. government, now I'm talking about, had any humanitarian feelings with regard to Somalia, it had plenty of time to show it. For example, it could have shown it right up till 1990, when the U.S. was the chief supporter of Siad Barre, who had destroyed the country. I was killing maybe 50 or 60,000 people with U.S. aid. All right, when our favorite tyrant collapsed, the U.S. pulled out, and in fact, civil war broke out and starvation and so on. The U.S. did nothing. I mean, the famine and everything else was at its peak, and the fighting in early 1992, mid-1992, U.S. did nothing. As 1992 went along, the famine was declining. In fact, it was pretty much, it was getting fairly under control. Efficient outfits, like, say, the Red Cross, said they were getting about 95% of their aid through, which is a pretty good record. The fighting had declined. There had been some agreements. There was, in fact, a UN negotiator, Mahmoud Sahnoun, who was having great success in bringing everyone together, so he was naturally kicked out immediately, meaning the U.S. accepted that, because the UN doesn't do anything without the U.S. accepting it. By the November election, around then, it was clear that this is an opportunity for good photo ops. if we send 30,000 Marines in when the famine is declining and the fighting is sort of getting to be in order, we'll get really nice shots of Marine colonels handing out cookies to starving children, and that'll look good. It'll be a shot in the arm for the Pentagon budget. And in fact, it was described that way. You look back at what Colin, Powell was saying and others, they're saying, well, it's going to look good for the Pentagon. Of course, Bush understood, and everybody understood, and, I wrote in December, pretty soon it's going to be a disaster. I mean, when you put a foreign military force into a country, it's not going to take long before they're fighting the population. That's almost automatic, even if the population welcomed them. Like if we had foreign soldiers, coming in here and running things, maybe to do things for us, we'd be shooting at them in 2 months, okay? Like, you take, say, Northern Ireland. The British were called in by the Catholic population. Okay, a couple of months later, they were murdering the Catholic population. I mean, that's what foreign armies are like, and the dynamics are clear. So it was only a question of how long it would be. And now we're in the middle of it, but, they figured that'd be somebody else's problem. Now, maybe it turned out, you could ask the question whether the Somalis benefited or were harmed by this action. You can certainly ask that question. And I'm not certain what the answer is. But whatever happened, they were just incidental. I mean, they were props for photo opportunities. Maybe they were helped, I hope so, but if so, it's just purely incidental.
We've come to the end of our time for questions today. I'd like to thank Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Michio Kaku. Please stay in your seats for just another moment for a couple of announcements. One thing, as we end our program today on the discussion of Somalia, which has become perhaps one of the linchpin areas of conflict in the New World Order, one of the books that's available on sale outside Altered States, A Reader in the New World Order, that includes Noam Chomsky's introduction entitled World Orders Old and New, as well as a feature article by Michio Kaku on the question of contingency plans, nuclear weapons after the Cold War, and my article on the United Nations. Today's program, I think, has been a very important one for Worldview and the WBAI Public Affairs Department. We'd like to thank especially Art DeLugoff for providing space for us today, and he has a few words for us today. Please wait for just a moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, honored lecturers. I think you're in the right place in saying the right things, or the left things, whatever you might call them. Anyway, you're reaching out, and maybe people will understand what's really happening, and not just what's the flim-flam. I'm very privileged and proud to have these lectures here. We've had things like this on the Israeli-Palestinian issue going back for 25 years. People don't know that. Hanan Ashrawi and Faisal Husseini and, oh God, so many have been here through the Israeli peace movement and so forth all these years. And we're happy there's a start, although as Professor Chomsky has pointed out, it might not be as good as most would like, but at least it is a start. And hopefully it'll get a lot better, and hopefully it won't be at least as many problems as we think there will be, and there certainly will be. Anyway, I would like to tell you all you're welcome here. We have some other programs that will be coming up. Somebody else will be telling you about them. I want to tell you the Village Gate is fighting for its life to stay alive and become a not-for-profit, which it is already. And we're going to legalize and formalize it. So why not? And if we can continue doing things like this and keeping it diverse and multicultural and interesting, I think that's what we want to happen. So thanks for coming, and come back again.
Thank you very much.